Hello everyone, I wanted to share some information with you about a really important aspect of stories, of literature. It's one of the main literary elements that we'll be looking at this semester. It is point of view. Who is telling us the story? When we think about point of view, we think about who the speaker is, the voice that is telling us that story that we're listening to or that we're reading. Certainly defined as the narrator, but in particular, the relation in which the narrator stands to the story. What's their relationship with the story? Did this story happen to them? Is it something that they're expressing? Have they heard this story? Do they know that there's an audience there listening to this story? All of these are questions for point of view. If we think about the interlopers from last week, that was a story told in the third person. And we'll get to first person and third person here in a second. But that voice that was expressing the story knew the history of the conflict, could almost get into both characters' minds, both Geirog and Ulrich. We saw what they were thinking about. They knew the dialogue of the story. They certainly survived the story, which is not true for the characters in the story. But so that was an outside perspective, a third-person perspective. It would be very different if it were told in the first person. If we heard just from Ulrich or just from Geirog and what that experience was like, we would get much more personal information about them. By keeping it in the third person, we get a larger picture, a bigger scope, and for that story it makes sense because it is, I think, trying to express an idea about life that's more important than just one person. Now, when we think about types of narrators, there's 4 different ones to consider. We got innocent narrators. This is a character who fails to understand all the implications of the story. They've maybe gone through the story, they've lived through it, but they don't really understand the meaning of it or what it means for them or what it could mean for us, the reader. Not necessarily a common one, but there certainly are characters and stories that we read where the narrator just is unaware of what the story means for us. An unreliable narrator, a narrator who is deceptive, who is self-deceptive, deluded, or deranged. This can certainly be fun from the first-person point of view if you're writing a story, to create a character who we can't trust, that we know we can't trust. Makes for a fun reading experience. We have a participant narrator. Participant narrator. Someone who's involved in the action, but not necessarily the main character. They watch it from afar. And then we have an omniscient narrator, God's eye perspective, a voice that understands many character perspectives. Going back to the interlopers, I think that was an omniscient narrator. We didn't quite see into the foresters, like what are those groups of men doing while Ulrich and Geirog are trapped under the tree. We didn't really get into the minds of the townspeople, but we were certainly in the minds of all the characters that were going through the action, Ulrich and Geirog. Now, those are the 4 different types, and we're going to use that information for our reading quiz and discussion assignment this week. So make sure you understand the innocent narrator, the unreliable narrator, the participant narrator, and the omniscient narrator. Now let's talk about first person and third person, the most common types of point of view. First person is the narrator being a participant. The story happened to them. They were involved in it. We see it through their eyes, and we only see it through their eyes. They might understand the implications of the story. They might not. But anyways, we are limited to their viewpoint. And it is a limitation. We don't get to see into other characters' minds, only what that one character could see of the other characters. I'm going to be reading a story called Cathedral this week by Raymond Carver. This is a first-person point of view story we're seeing only through the husband's eyes, only through the husband's experience of that night. Think about how it would be a very different story if we saw it through the other characters' eyes or points of view. If we saw it through the wife's point of view or Robert's point of view, the friend of the wife who comes to visit for dinner. We're only seeing it from the husband's point of view, and that makes it, I think, a pretty interesting story. We also are reading another story this week which is titled What Things We Knew When the House Caught Fire. Now, this isn't a first-person point of view story. This is a third-person point of view story. Actually kind of both. Because we get a community perspective, and then we also get a individual character perspective. So we almost have both versions here. That word in the title, Things We Knew When the House Caught Fire. It's not things I knew, things we knew when the house caught fire, points us to this community perspective. But then, interestingly enough, the narrator of that story isn't necessarily the major character. It's somebody maybe standing on the sidelines watching things happen to the major characters. So when we get into third person, we're talking about 4 different types of third person point of view. And it's good to know the differences. As long as you can identify third person point of view, that's fine with me. But it's good to know the different ones. We have that omniscient third person, which is seeing into the life of many characters, all-knowing. We have a limited third-person point of view, where you're seeing just into one major character's kind of thoughts in mind. Limited into seeing into one minor character's thoughts in mind. And in an objective third-person point of view, not really seeing into the minds of any characters. That's, I think, more rare. Omniscient is probably, and limited are probably the most 2 common versions of third person. And again, that third person is an outside perspective. The story isn't happening to them. But they might have information about all of the characters that the story is happening to. So it's outside, not happening to them. That voice isn't personal. It's not the I voice, that's first person. It's not the you voice, that's second person. It's an outside perspective, but they have information. Take a look at this right here. This is from Madame Bovary, a famous novel by Gustave Flaubert, late 1800s novel. And this is a section in the story where one of the main characters meets another main character who he eventually falls in love with. He's a doctor. He's going to this woman's father's house to help him. And I'm going to read it to you. Think about what type of point of view is being used here. Charles went up the first floor to see the patient. He found him in his bed, sweating under his bedclothes, having thrown his cotton nightcap right away from him. He was a fat little man of 50 with white skin and blue eyes, the forepart of his head bald, and he wore earrings. By his side, on a chair, stood a large decanter of brandy, whence he poured himself a little from time to time to keep up his spirits. But as soon as he caught sight of the doctor, his elation subsided, and instead of swearing, as he had been doing for the last 12 hours, began to groan freely. Fracture was a simple one, without any kind of complication. Charles could not have hoped for an easier case. Then calling to mind the devices of his masters at the bedsides of patients, he comforted the sufferer with all sorts of kindly remarks. Those caresses of the surgeon that are like the oil they put in bistules. In order to make some splints, a bundle of laths was brought up. In order to make splints, a bundle of laths was brought up from the cart house. Charles selected one, cut it into 2 pieces, and planed it with a fragment of window pane, while the servant tore up sheets to make bandages, and Mademoiselle Emma tried to sew some pads. As she was a long time before she found her work case, her father grew impatient. She did not answer, but as she sewed, she pricked her fingers, which she then put to her mouth to suck them. Charles was surprised at the whiteness of her nails. They were shiny, delicate at the tips, more polished than the ivory of Dieppe, and almond-shaped. Yet her hand was not beautiful, perhaps not white enough, and a little hard at the knuckles. Besides, it was too long, with no soft inflections in the outlines. Her real beauty was in her eyes. Now, this is not first-person point of view, because we're not hearing, I thought this, I saw that. This is third-person point of view. Is it omniscient? Is it limited? Is it all-knowing? I think here, what we see is a kind of mixture of both, but really focused in on one character's thoughts. We're really seeing into the mind of Charles, the doctor who shows up, what he's thinking, how he's reflecting on using the techniques that he studied when he was studying in medical school. His ability to create a cast for the fracture. Then finally, at the end, how he thinks about this woman who's sewing up some material for that cast that they're making for him. He thinks about her knuckles. He thinks about her fingernails. He compares them to other things that he's seen. And then we hear about how he feels about her eyes. That's very much focused on his thoughts. Not so much her thoughts. We don't hear what she thinks about him. We don't quite get into the father's thoughts. I mean, we get a little information about him, that he's drinking brandy, that he's been impatient, and then when he sees the doctor, he starts to groan in pain. But we don't really get into his mind. Oh, look at this doctor coming in. I think he looks like a good doctor. We don't hear that. We really just are limited to what Charles is thinking. So this would be an example of third person limited narration style, or limited point of view. For the stories you're reading this week, think about what that choice of point of view does for the story. What does it serve the story? Is it pointed towards helping express the idea about life, maybe the theme? Is it pointed towards giving us character information, that point of view? Usually point of view does give us a lot of character information. Is it being used in another type of form? Perhaps to, in the case of Cathedral, maybe reveal the husband's point of view in his mind, and it's his story to be changed by, so we get to see how his mind changes. By looking through his eyes, we see his perspective changing, and that's maybe the point of the story in Cathedral. So think about how point of view is being used. It's an interesting element of literature. All right, there we go. Point of view. If you have any questions or concerns about this, please feel free to reach out to me over email. And I hope you enjoyed the stories for this week.